Happy Wednesday. Like Attila's showing off the book he's got. Nice. Oh, look, an instrument. All right, wonderful to see a bunch of friendly faces. We'll let a couple more people wander in. Uh, it's wonderful to have everyone here. Welcome to the first official workshop of our 2025-2026 academic year scheduled for this workshop from the Center of Cultural Affairs. It's great to have all of you here. This year's workshop is going to try to roughly pick up on a theme of policy-related issues, especially policy-related issues in a global context. Perhaps for the Americans, that'll be a welcome vacation away from arts and cultural policy in a domestic setting. It'll be nice to see how the rest of the world works sometimes. But this is our general sort of overarching theme, and we're lucky to have our first speaker here, David Maggs, kick us off on this topic. He'll bring a little international perspective on all of this, and I think help sharpen our thinking about a lot of these issues. And regardless, it's going to be a great conversation. I met David earlier this year, and I was excited that he was willing to come and speak to this group because we always have great conversations. So without listening to me anymore.
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
Which is thank you to CBS and Trina Billet, who is also co-hosting the workshop series this semester. So this global cultural policy theme is very much in collaboration with CBS and Trina and me and Doug and the CCA. So if you'll see the series over the course of the next 3 months, you're going to see a lot of really kind of new, interesting speakers that we don't necessarily have. And so again, due to the collaboration. So I wanted to point that out.
Thank you. The CBS in this case is the Copenhagen Business School, not a different CBS. So we've gone global this year in every way, and we're excited to be partnering with the Copenhagen Business School folks and our European friends. But tonight we're going north of the border this afternoon with David. So without any more preamble, please take it away.
All right. Thanks so much, Doug. It's a pleasure to join you guys and have this conversation and to hear the global spirit still resonating down your way. So based on the invitation that I was given, I want to explore a policy proposal that we're developing up here in Canada that I think will itself reveal a fair bit about the state our cultural sector is in, the role we expect our cultural sector to play, and the means by which we expect it to play that role and how that might be changing given the current demographic and commercial and fiscal circumstances that are surrounding that sector. Because what I'm going to be talking about is somewhat unfamiliar territory in a lot of cultural policy conversations, and because we're crossing a pretty thick border in terms of very different national systems for producing culture, I want to do most of this in dialogue with you. And so I'm going to just convey the basic sense of what I want to talk about in as brief a spell as possible, and then just get to discussion with all of you right away. So I want to begin by asking you to imagine you're watching someone trying to collect water in a bucket with a hole in it, and they can tell it's not filling up. And so they're scrambling around, desperately trying to find more water to pour in faster in order to prevent that bucket from running dry. Eventually, wouldn't you feel compelled to go over there and say, hey, maybe we should try fixing the bucket instead? So arts and social finance is a proposal with that strategy in mind, a strategy to not only put new revenue into Canada's cultural sector, but to transform our cultural nonprofits from precarious, marginal, and dependent to entrepreneurial, relevant, and sustainable. So the causes of current precarity are likely familiar to an American audience. What is perhaps distinct up our way is that our usual claim to the government of chronic underfunding just got harder for us to make as this historic level of precarity follows a decade of historic increases in arts granting across the country. Needing a lot more money after a decade of getting a lot more money is not a very good look. And yet, most of what we hear publicly from our sector just reinforces the standard claim that we've always made. We just need more grants. Over the past few years, I've talked to a lot of arts leaders and policymakers across the country, and there's something I feel fairly certain that I can share with you today. It's that I don't think we actually believe it. I've asked people if we just increase granting by 10 or 20% across the board, will our sector become sustainable? Nobody says yes. It's all we ask for because it's all we know how to ask for. Even if we know that rising precarity cannot be solved by increased public funding alone, we keep trying to do that because we don't know what else to do. Around the world, however, all kinds of nonprofits and social enterprises from other public benefit sectors are learning to work with a new source of funding, learning to combine grants with loans in the form of social finance to help diversify revenues and expand operational capacity. And the good news for us is that Canada is right there. The federal government just put a $755 million social finance fund in place, connecting investment to impact across a number of areas, including health, environment, public safety, gender and racial equity, education, and justice. The bad news, however, is that the cultural sector is nowhere to be found on that list. So there's $755 million serving the public good in Canada, and culture got left out, despite clear evidence of its impacts on the country. An arts and social finance fund is an option on the table for resourcing culture in Canada, a fund that combines public, philanthropic, and private capital to offer repayable capital in the form typically of low interest loans to cultural nonprofits. And that gives you a basic sense of what I mean today when I say social finance, pulling together different sources of capital to make low interest lending available to organizations that have limited access to capital and deliver profound social good to their communities. Now, it's probably not a surprise for any of you to learn that most cultural nonprofits in Canada are not investment ready. They're not ready to work with loans. They're not ready to generate a return on capital. They're barely surviving with grants, never mind money that they would have to pay back. And so an essential element of this work is market building or creating the investment readiness, something that we see as having two central components. First, capacity building, so building up the governance, financial management, entrepreneurial instincts, commercial skills, and community engagement needed to secure, carry, and repay a loan. And secondly, product development, creating activity that generates revenue above expenses, that earns more than it costs to produce. Now, in a sector that is mostly lacking both capacity and investable activity, this market building or investment readiness component is what expands the Arts and Social Finance Fund from a straightforward banking solution to a broader strategy aiming at sectoral transformation. So that's why we at the Metcalf Foundation are so interested in social finance for Canada's cultural sector, because it isn't just a way to find more water, it's a way to fix the bucket. So I know this personally from two perspectives. First, as leader of an organization called Camber Arts. It's a small cultural nonprofit in Western Newfoundland, which is the easternmost part of Canada, an island way off on the East Coast, which is where I'm from. So you can sort of think of like Maine and then go well north and well east of that, and you've got a sense of just how isolated that part of the world is. When it became clear to us that grants were never going to stabilize our operation, we started working with loans to outgrow the limits of our grant dependence. And that difference between a grant and a loan was really crucial. So when you get an arts grant in Canada, what you've done is you've put your artistic vision on an application. It has been reviewed by an elite jury of your peers, and you have been chosen. And you open that letter, you see the word congratulations, and you feel like you've already earned your money. You've had your success. It doesn't really matter whether anyone cares about what you do next, not your audience, not your community, and not your market. But when you get a loan, that's when you say to yourself, oh, okay, now I need to start earning that money. Now it matters if my audience cares, if my community shows up, if my market values my activity. And so for Camber Arts, that difference transformed our relationship to community. It diversified our revenue streams, it professionalized our staff, and it ended up doubling the size of our operation. Knowing that there is nothing more annoying, however, than the zeal of a convert, than someone who takes what happened to work for them and immediately assumes that it is going to work for everyone else, I had to figure out whether this effect was unique to us or not. And so to do this, I joined some colleagues over at the Policy and Evidence Center in the UK to review arts and culture finance. So this was a 10-year, $60 million pilot social finance fund that invested in over 30 organizations across the UK. So while loans are relatively new to the cultural sector, we now have an emerging range of case studies that includes Canada, the US, Kenya, Australia, and the United Kingdom, and it's all pointing to a basic hypothesis. And this is really at the heart of what I want to discuss with you today, is that weaving the right amount of repayable capital into the balance sheets of a cultural nonprofit matures that organization across a range of variables more effectively than grants alone. So the chance to talk to an American audience about that hypothesis is really one of the main reasons I was excited to get to spend an hour with you today. Now, here it's crucial to understand that this is not a replacement. So it's an additive relationship. If we replaced grants with loans to all those cultural nonprofits in Canada, they wouldn't mature, they would just collapse. If we integrate loans in an additive fashion, then we have something that's like vitamins in our diet or rebar in our cement. It doesn't replace those original ingredients, but it allows us to do more with them, strengthening balance sheets, supporting long-term planning and investment, encouraging entrepreneurial thinking, driving financial accountability, enabling innovation, diversifying income, spurring growth beyond granting, expanding accountability to community, shifting from an artist-centric to an audience-centric mindset, and yielding a more resilient and self-sustaining cultural ecosystem. So what would a fund like this look like? So from here, we turn to the land of the hypothetical just to try and give you a bit of a concrete glimpse into how we're proposing to build this arts and social finance fund. Now, central to the design is the way that we integrate the involvement of various public funders of the arts, different government departments operating at different levels. So where the US has a big landscape of foundations, Canada has a combination of federal and provincial ministries of culture, along with federal and provincial arts councils. So the next two slides that I'll show you just lay out how those different verticals might be involved in an initiative like this. But this is all just at the sort of design level. Following meetings with a lot of the provincial and municipal arts councils, so not the cultural ministries, but the arts councils from across the country, there's an eagerness there to participate in that capacity building dimension of the work, the market building we were talking about a moment ago, where sectoral transformation is we try and build that out of investment readiness. We're envisioning a fund size of about 100 million, consisting of a combination of non-repayable capital, which will be used for the market building, and repayable capital, which will be used for the investment or return-seeking capital. That non-repayable capital is shown here in this pie graph, where we're referring to this as market building capital and scoping it at roughly about 25% of the overall fund size, ballpark about 25 million. Building grants that help organizations create capacity through non-repayable capital that supports them to create those investable activities and build up the required capacity they need to deliver those activities. Now, this builds on the lessons of the Social Finance Fund that was already created here in Canada for everybody except culture. And it also builds on the Arts and Culture Finance Fund in the UK. It resonates certainly with the work that the MacArthur Foundation has been doing in the US in collaboration with an entity called BDC. And the claim there is without effective market building, so without creating that readiness, the transformational effect we're looking for will fail to materialize. On the return side, the return-seeking capital, let's assume that's about 75 million, is then made up of a layer of first loss capital put in place by the feds and the provinces in order to then attract new money, money that is not presently playing around in the cultural sector. So philanthropic capital, ideally at concessionary rates, and then private capital that's either never had the inclination or the opportunity to invest in Canada's cultural sector before. This is the Federal Social Finance Fund model, so we know that this has been done in Canada. It's also the UK's Arts and Culture Finance model, so that we know it's been done in culture. So this is our opportunity to do this for culture in Canada. So what would a pathway to launching a $100 million arts and social finance fund look like? Well, much of this work is already underway with a preliminary fund design taking shape, positive dialogue with arts councils, foundations, and major private sector partners, and a national tour that we're doing on demand side engagement with arts organizations in Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, Winnipeg, Halifax, Montreal, and Toronto. And so this fall, we're going to be turning to that building that the effective readiness activity that offers genuinely transformative impact on participating organizations. And I can tell you that's the component of this work that keeps me up at night. How do you intervene in these organizations to fundamentally not only change their activities, but change their mindset and change their capacity so that they can start to diversify their revenue streams? And then we're starting to work on building that capital pool now. We've already received strong enthusiasm from some of our big commercial banks and a range of foundations from across the country. So the new capital here is not actually hard to attract. It's really building the market that you can deploy that capital into. So we've had roundtable sessions with the provincial and federal arts councils to clarify their role in that market building challenge. And since we've met with all the provincial ministries about how we can bring together a coordinated investment to not only support Canada's cultural nonprofit sector, but also to transform that sector, one organization, one deal at a time. From the perspective of an arts organization, what would it look like to go through this in a kind of step-by-step fashion? So that begins with awareness, a lot of promotional work around the investment opportunity, something that we've been doing for a few years now. Then comes a clear, transparent, objective process of expressing interest that isn't too burdensome and provides early feedback to arts organizations. This could involve interested art organizations completing an intake form, profiling their capacity, and giving us a sense of what their proposed activity looks like. Then a review process would separate these applications into three streams: a kind of no, with a request to revise and resubmit; a maybe, where there are good candidates for the readiness support to develop their idea and their capacity further; and then finally the straight up yes, where we're ready for a full proposal because we think the project is investable and we think they've got the capacity to deliver it. We assume that the vast majority of organizations we expect will fall into that maybe category. Very few organizations we anticipate will come to us investment ready with an investable project ready to go. And once those orgs have gone through the capacity building programming associated with the fund, we've had time to develop their project further. We'll then move them on to the creation of a full proposal. We then work with that proposal to develop the investment structure, the loan terms, the incentive package, and that leads to the investment committee recommendation, which brings us to the approval phase where the investment committee meets, recommends the projects that it sees ready for investment, and our board approves or requests revisions. Investments get made, funds are advanced, approved investments then receive a lot of wraparound supports to mitigate risk and amplify success, and then ongoing monitoring and evaluation practices that they would have learned in the readiness phase start to track the financial and social returns on investment, which leads us to this really unique moment for cultural policy and funding in Canada, which is repayment and redeployment. So as that fund comes back, the money comes back into the fund, we can then send that money back out into new loans to new applicants. So when cultural sovereignty and national interest became such crucial themes for Canada in the wake of certain geopolitical events taking place in a country that happens to border ours, I won't tell you which one that is right now, it was a reminder as to why strong publicly funded culture is essential to this country. It amplified the difference between our cultural needs and our entertainment needs, and it made it clear why Canada cannot leave its cultural needs to Netflix. Yet, if we want our cultural sector to deliver on things like nation building, reconciliation with our Indigenous communities, collective well being, mental health, civic engagement, youth development, and economic vitality, all the big list of things that we say cultural sectors deliver, we've got to relieve their precarity, we've got to drive accountability, and we've got to reward innovation. A funding ecosystem such as we currently have right now in Canada, one that is increasingly grant dependent, shaped by legacy, and dominated by advocacy and lobbying that large organizations are able to do, is not conducive to those strategic changes. What's encouraging us to act now on this initiative is that it allows Canada's cultural nonprofit sector to participate in some big key national objectives that have emerged over the past few months. Public-private partnerships, unlocking significant private and philanthropic investment, system building, establishing long-term cultural capital infrastructure to support resilience, sustainability, and innovation, nation building and interprovincial cohesion, so investments that move across regions governed with provincial input that supports a national unified growth while respecting those regional priorities. Innovation and economic security deploys a new funding model and tools that enable adaptive entrepreneurial behavior across the sector, and then immediate actionability. This fund is shovel-ready, co-designed by experienced intermediaries, and aligned with the government's readiness and accountability expectations. What I would go further and say is demanding that we act on right now in Canada and bring this a Canadian cultural policy moment forward like this is because we need to acknowledge that the clock is ticking on our opportunity to do something transformative in response to rising precarity throughout the sector. So in Canada, we act as if we will always be able to fix the problem of cultural nonprofit precarity, as if there will always be the internal capacity within our cultural organizations to change, along with the external public support the sector will need in order to do so. So first, as I think is common across the border, a growing number of cultural nonprofits are approaching such a state of decline here that experimentation, innovation, transformation, all of these things grow increasingly difficult. Second, as a recent Nanos poll indicated up here in Canada, the number of Canadians who felt that the arts and culture sector made the country a better place dropped dramatically in just 2 years, 15%, more than it did for our military, our police, or even our Senate, which in the case of Canada is a pretty useless branch of government. So those are very worrying declines. And these are declines in both internal capacity and external opportunity, demanding a strong national initiative to try and transform our sector into a more accountable and relevant presence in our communities. Now, cultural policy in Canada is littered with efforts to do this sort of thing through grant-based initiatives. While grants are and will remain very important instruments of preservation in our cultural sector, they really struggle to operate as generative tools of transformation. So rather than trying to get a different result by doing the same thing over and over again, it's clear that cultural policy in this country really needs a different approach. And the moment, because of so many different factors, has really arrived where the time for us to act in a pretty bold way is right now. Everybody in the sector knows that the status quo is not working. There was great hope post-pandemic that we could just reboot the model. And I think really by the spring of 2024, that hope had really expired and there was a renewed sense, okay, we can't simply go back to status quo. The political climate that we're in is primed for some bold national initiatives. We see this working in the UK and in Australia with sectors that are quite similar to Canada's, and the new money is ready. It's waiting to be leveraged by a strategic public investment. So arts and social finance is built to bring together the feds, the provinces, the arts councils, philanthropic foundations, and the private sector to give Canada one of the biggest and boldest cultural investment funds in the world. So thanks very much. That's the context on the piece, and I look forward to discussing this with you.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Thank you. This is great and obviously very timely stuff. So let's start the conversation. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat, so you won't have to, David, and moderate there. But go ahead, anyone, and raise a hand, and let's ask a question. Another Canadian is eager to jump in line. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Doug, and thank you, David, for that really interesting talk. I should say I've actually been to Corner Brook, so I know where you're from. Here is my worry. The cultural sector in Canada and in the United States, it seems to me, has spent decades talking about capacity building and revenue diversification and new market opportunities. That is a discussion that is very long term. I teach or taught in an arts administration program that was all about capacity building, right? Sending eager young people out to work in the field and so on. And so the idea that if only there were more financial capital that nonprofit arts organizations could access, somehow these efforts at capacity building and market generation that we've been doing for a long time, but still seem to leave the sector precarious, will suddenly take a jump forward. And so I guess I need, or would request an explanation of just how does that really happen? Because it's not completely obvious to me that this will be different from all of the things that we've actually been doing before in terms of what arts councils have been trying to encourage.
Yeah. I agree completely. I think the distinction, because I point to all of those efforts that have, I mean, not all of them, but, I'm certainly aware that there's this immense legacy of pumping grant capital into the sector with the anticipation that we can get a different result because on the top of the grant, it says organizational change or transformation or something to that effect. One of the things that we've learned in talking to so many different organizations about this, and I know this from my own practice as well, is that I have taken a lot of those grants that were about capacity building and organizational transformation as a struggling cultural nonprofit that's trying to find ways to keep the lights on and the programming happening. I have taken up those grants that are called organizational change grant completely with the spirit of fantastic, this is now going to allow me to keep on going as I was. So that the actual spirit with which that granting capital is taken up, however it might be all about kind of big capacity changing things, is one of actually maintaining status quo. Even though we call the grants this and that, and we have to write reports on all the things we did to become different, the underlying spirit with which it's taken up is actually not that. And so we're really trying to ask ourselves as carefully as we can, not to blame organizations for doing that, but to say, what is it that actually creates the conditions where that very elusive path of I want to take the path of becoming something different is suddenly something I'm willing to go down? What do we have to do around those circumstances? So that's sort of one thing, which is I think about the kind of attention that we need to pay and realize that this is something that we need to be aware of. To your point, that's how I would describe exactly what you're talking about, that there's just been so much capital put into the sector to try and create difference, and it's all been taken up with the spirit of maintaining the same thing. If there's a theory that I can propose here, and I hope perhaps to know more about this over the next 5 years, but I think certainly I saw this in our own organization, and I saw it in a lot of the organizations that I spoke to in the UK, is that there's a relationship between risk, accountability, relevance, and resilience. And that if you can connect those four things, then that's the path that is a kind of answer to your question. That what we're proposing is that it's actually not the amount of money that suddenly is available, it's that the money comes with an element of risk. And that qualitative difference is the thing that drives a level of accountability. Now, I know that that's going to be a controversial term. We've gotten lots of pushback around saying, well, wait, we're accountable already. And I think there are many ways in which you are, or cultural nonprofits are, but there's a version of accountability I like to bracket out there that then creates that enhanced level of relevance within a particular community, a particular audience, and a particular market, and that as the thing that actually has the resilience effect in the end. So whether it was the organization that I worked with and understanding from the inside out, or I can point you to a wonderful master's thesis from the team that delivered Arts and Culture Finance by a woman named Rachel Green, who did an economic analysis on defining what resilience was and then checking to see was there a positive change in resilience over the course of the organizations that worked with the fund with risk essentially in the UK. So that would be how I would answer that question. And I'd love to come back with even more empirical data behind that, but at least that's the theory that we're testing about why is this different?
Thanks, David. Another question. Alan, did you want to jump in?
Hi, hi, David.
Hi, nice to see you,
Hello,
Alan.
everyone. Fascinating stuff. I'm trying not to say how idealistic this sounds to me because I just work with so many nonprofits who are desperate for consumable capital. So repayable capital is a challenge. I think it would be a rare organization in my world that would be ready for that. But I guess my question is, first of all, I just posted, there's an example of an opera company here in Detroit that acquired a parking deck and operates it at approximately a $2 million profit every year, which would be the equivalent of a $40 million endowment. And it's not really program related, it's ancillary, but it's probably the most brilliant thing they've done in terms of sustainability.
Mhm.
So my question is that on or off your radar map as a financing?
Yeah.
And then when people draw down loans, are they segregated as liabilities on the balance sheet, or are they allowed to suck them into operating cash and basically eat them?
I can speak for. I'll do the first question, and then get to the second one in a moment. So, funnily enough, there's also Harbor Center up here in Toronto. Also has a parking garage, and it was a sort of minor asset for a long time until a big construction project cut out the main parking source a few blocks down the road, and suddenly they've been making huge money off their parking garage. So maybe there's a kind of concrete recommendation here around really good cultural infrastructure turns out to be parking garages. What we've tried to do with this is to do something a little bit different than Arts and Culture Finance did in the UK, where they wanted to have very specific relationships between arts activities and social impact. And so the whatever the intervention was, for them to qualify for the fund with the UK, they had to be able to deliver a very concrete social impact as a result of the investable activity. So in that case, a parking garage would be a tough sell. What we want to do here in Canada is to say we want to get to the social impact piece in a moment, but we just want to start with organizations by establishing a spectrum of use. And we're thinking about, so if we say to organizations, think of an investable activity, and they say, what's an investable activity? We think about it in terms of what we typically see sits along a spectrum from the most common thing of buildings. When people are ready to build a building, they'll pretty comfortably use repayable capital for a portion of that. We see a lot of it in the bridge financing space where they know they're getting a grant about a year from now, and this is just so that they can start the programming now. Again, pretty low risk. To the space, what we're calling mission agnostic. So things that really have nothing to do with your core mission, but that would do wonders for your ability to actually serve that mission, like a parking garage or wine bars or other sort of revenue generating activities. Then further down the spectrum to the realm of mission adjacent, so where we see this emerging as investable activity is when it's artists doing their thing as artists, or the arts organization doing what they do as artists, but doing in a different market context, like health or well-being or education or recidivism. Sometimes this is in a kind of outcomes financing structure, but it's what they do, just not in their normal context of operation, all the way down to the mission aligned stuff where they really believe in a piece of IP that they want to try and commercialize. And so what we're trying to do is make sure that that spectrum of use is amenable to this fund, so that you could show up with a great plan of buying a parking garage. We'll do the work and with you in terms of demonstrating the way in which that was going to amplify your ability to serve your mission. And that's the sort of thing that we would want the capital to pay for.
Great. I'll note that you use the word commercialization here.
Okay. And probably remind me of that at some point down the road.
Thanks.
Excellent. Jeffrey.
Thanks, Doug. Hi, David. Great to see you.
Great to see you too.
By chance, I'm actually tomorrow morning having coffee with Franz Anderson, who is leading the initiative in the UK and has been for some years that you referred to. I'm responding in some ways to Michael's degree of skepticism about how you can get this to actually take off. You and I, David, in the past, when you, particularly in the context of art and the world after this, and I tried to persuade you that the way you make these things happen is not by trying to persuade loads and loads of people in the sector that this is the way forward, but to find willing partners and to get the thing off the ground and to show that it can work, and then hope you gather other people in. I thought of the analogy of desistance theory in criminology, which is now sort of the dominant theory in how you get people out of the criminal justice system. And it's not that you ask people to say that they no longer commit crime, but you ask them to believe that it is possible to become somebody who doesn't commit crime, and they want to be that person. And I think that's the kind of journey you want to take some arts or non-profits on, getting to believe that this is possible. And my own view is that you can't do it at scale the way Michael was obviously, concerned that that's very problematic. But I think you can begin with some organizations, and that's the way to get this sort of thing off the ground.
When we were talking, so I should just say Jeff Krosick is one of my prime mentors in a lot of the cultural policy thinking that I've done. And when we were talking about the early days of the work that I was in, the next moment was to say, okay, well, those are some good ideas. What are you going to do? What's a concrete activity that you could do? So this is it, Professor Krosick. This is an attempt to try and put some of that in play. I take the kind of harm reduction versus regenerative approach from the sustainability world as well. It's much easier to try and get people to believe in doing a good than in reducing a harm. And so I think there's probably a lot of different contexts where that basic spirit plays out. The question about what it means to do this at scale, in the sort of sense of when you open this fund, do you need to deploy $100 million in that fiscal year? What's nice about the difference between grants and loans, and particularly the way that we're setting this up, is we're proposing to actually put very little of the capital out in the early years of the fund. Most of that is going to be market building activity, and then working with early adopters. So you're leaning the analysis of the investment committee towards financial return on investment, so less on the kind of cultural return on investment, because you really want some good narratives out there for both perspectives, for cultural organizations that can believe in using it, and also for the investment community that can say culture is now investable. the work that France Anderson, Siva Phillips, and the team at Figurative did to set a precedent on this has really done wonders for the viability of the idea in other contexts. Being able to see those case studies that went through a time of the pandemic and made this work, proving that cultural organizations can be investable, I think has done a lot in terms of being able to demonstrate that this is a viable way of not only putting capital into an organization, but also working it towards a path of greater resilience. If there's one thing I would do differently here than in the UK, that I think speaks to the question that you raise around the proposal that this can be transformative for an organization, is I think they weren't as explicit on that as a central value proposition. That the goal was so much in that early piloting phase just to prove that culture was investable. And we appreciate that so much, because I think that if that was the first goal, it was a big one, and we've all been able to build on that. We want to now say, okay, if ACF in the early years of that fund proved that culture is investable, now what we want to do is prove that investment is transformative and go deeper into that. There's evidence for it. There's either very good evidence from Rachel Green, or we know it in all the sort of I think relevant anecdotal ways in talking to the organizations themselves. But we need to figure out what is it that really makes sure that transformative capacity is possible, and how do you optimize a loan structure to do that? And that's what we're going to be trying to learn over the next year, working very closely with those. Does that sort of capture the spirit of your inquiry?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, David. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jen. Before we go to Joanne, I want to jump back to the chat, where there's a great question here from Katie, asking, why do you believe that experimentation, innovation, and transformation is necessarily consistent with designing programs where revenue exceeds expenses? Now, there's some larger arts organizations that already operate entrepreneurial internal markets. So could you say more about the lack of capacity from organizational leaders?
So absolutely, that I think a lot of organizations do a ton of work in the realm of experimentation, innovation, and even transformation, and it has nothing to do with revenue diversification. So that is the specific goal that we are putting on it, that we want those qualities to be put in service of revenue diversification. So while the funds in the UK were actually looking at trying to solve very specific problems, such as the social problems that were associated with those, or the kind of benefits that they were trying to deliver, we want to start this fund just with the challenge of precarity, just dealing with the challenge of sector precarity and organizational precarity. That's the only problem that we want to solve in the early days of the fund, and then we want to branch out from there. So it is fundamentally about enlisting experimentation, innovation, and transformation in service to revenue diversification and addressing that level of precarity. So that's right, that they don't hang together inherently. It is a design feature in this case. Doug, what was the second half of that question?
Just about the arts organizations who already have entrepreneurial internal markets. So what does that tell you about the capacity of the organizational leaders and their lack of, if they can't do this?
I'm not sure I'm really understanding the nature of the example that's being held up. These are leaders that have entrepreneurial capacity, but they are not able to secure effective revenue diversification.
That's how I read it.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think we're going to have to accept that there's realms of cultural activity that we want to keep securely within the domain of market failure, and not say that everything that is going to have value from a cultural perspective needs to be able to generate revenue above expenses. I really like the fact that I grew up in a world where culture was a protected value, and if the market didn't value it, we did beyond what it would reflect. So I think we want to preserve that. What we're looking at is to work with organizations where they can become increasingly engaged with certain aspects of effective trade or investable activity. I think there's, if I could say that, I'll say the controversial side of this is that I think in many ways grants were designed to protect culture from market failure, knowing that it was such a precious thing that we had to have it regardless of whether it performed inside the market. But what we see with a lot of cultural nonprofits in Canada, particularly as cultural nonprofit, as any nonprofit is very slow to change, that the context in which they're operating is so different, they've changed so little that the grants are then protecting them from what I think is a widely held virtue, which is relevance and being able to engage in a meaningful service with their communities. With the organization that I run, what happened was when we started working with loans, the standard question, I don't know if it's like this in the US, but the standard question when you want to define your organization is you say, what's your vision? They ask the artistic director, what's the vision that drives your programming? What's my vision for this company? That's your KPI. And what we did when we started working with loans was we threw that out. We said, we're just not working with the question, what's my vision for this company anymore? From now on, all of our programming is going to run through a different question, which is, how does this activity meet the cultural needs of our community? And what that did was we had this concept on our hands, cultural needs. What are cultural needs? Are they different from entertainment needs? Are they different from health and well-being needs? What is distinct about cultural needs in this case? And what are the cultural needs of this place? And that level of specificity was the thing that really revamped our programming, and it drove the kind of relevance that we have with our community now, that even if you read our grant reports from 5 years ago, we said we had that kind of relevance. But if we really had that relevance, the level of transactional engagement with our market just wasn't there, and it is now. And so again, it goes back to the theory that I was proposing to Michael at the beginning, that connection between risk, accountability, relevance, and resilience is actually the thing that we're betting on here. And perhaps that's the component within a kind of leadership challenge to say, even if you're operating in the realm of generally the sort of the space of market failure, moving some aspect of what you do into a transactional relationship with your community is probably not just going to be good in terms of revenue diversification. It's probably going to have a stronger effect than that, which is the resilience of your relationship to your context. So that's how I would I'm not sure I'm making sense of the question properly, Doug, but that's how I would answer it.
Well, it was all good stuff, and maybe Katie can come back with a follow-up. But until then,
Okay.
Super talk, especially for this series. So thank you, David. I keep on going back to the application and sort of evaluation process that you laid out in one of your slides, and really trying to understand how that would work in practice. Also, I think I keep on imagining this type of policy sort of in the context of like a CDFI, and how it might differ from something like a CDFI that is targeted towards low income communities, how it actually works such that the organizations that receive funding go through some sort of application and evaluation process such that they don't default on these loans, and it doesn't work 100%, but it works to the extent that there's an insurance behind. And so now I'm trying to transfer the idea over to this and think about how the application and evaluation process would actually help solve some of the challenges that we see among cultural sector organizations. So, and the cultural sector as a whole. So, for example, I think one of those challenges you mentioned, which was this idea of, these larger organizations continuing to get most of the funding, and these smaller organizations, some that actually might have really great innovative potential, being left to sort of figure out things on their own. I wonder just if you could talk a little bit more about how the evaluation or application process would work, such that we would start to see perhaps the smaller, potentially innovative organizations start to come up and start to remove the status quo bias that we see in the sector. And even if you can provide any more details on that, I would love to hear them. And I also wanted to note that the other difference for me in what I'm hearing when you talk about the social finance fund and what I understand many other finance funds for, let's say more financially challenged communities looking like, is that so much of these current finance funds actually target cultural infrastructure, or sorry, infrastructure. And I'm wondering how you would design a finance fund that targets programs and programmatic development, and whether or not there's more risk in being able to finance those, less physical types of assets.
Yeah, no, those are all great questions that we've spent a lot of time thinking about. That's why we use that spectrum of use, where the challenges, like if you look at the projects that went through arts and culture finance in the UK, the majority of them are buildings, and that's typically what we see. Again, that fund, for very good reason, was biased towards securing financial return on investment. So it was really trying to make sure that we were fundamentally proving culture was investable. That was the goal, and for that reason, you probably saw that bias towards infrastructure that you're identifying. We wanted to lay out that spectrum so that we could at least always see on the end that mission aligned programming stuff staring us back in the face to say, how much have we been able to do down there? To that point, one of the things that we're working on is to make sure that a crucial design feature of this is how the lending instrument integrates with existing funding across that spectrum. So there is public funding for cultural infrastructure in Canada. How would the loan fund work, hand in glove with that funding? Because when we're talking to organizations, we say, come up with an investable activity, and they come up with some project that cost $100,000. They're then sort of crunching the numbers on a $100,000 loan. And we're saying that's probably not how this should work. It's probably the loan portion should be like $30,000, depending on where you are on that spectrum of use. But you're actually integrating yourself with all the existing funding that's available within that different space. What that does is it raises the question that I think is really relevant to the larger thing that you're asking about. When we say that risk is good, and that's sort of the argument that we're making, the kind of risk, accountability, relevance, resilience thing, and that introducing that level of risk that lending brings there, it's not just about improving the performance of the organizations, of the applicants. It's about improving the performance of the policymakers and the funders as well. So that if you're going to put $100,000 in grants out the door, you sort of get your terms and conditions signed and out you go in what they call the sort of spray and pray approach. But if you're putting loans out the door and you need that money back, your whole level of due diligence is at a much, much higher level. So you can imagine then if a portion of that capital infrastructure funding blended capital strategy is loans, the due diligence around the loan is going to benefit the spending of all the granting as well. So what we typically see with capital infrastructure grants in Canada is that there's a whole bunch of criteria by which a building project gets a grant, and it has nothing to do with the operational phase of that building. They don't scrutinize that at all. But if you're a lender inside that space, that's the portion of that project that you're going to scrutinize the most, because that's how you're getting your money back. But that should be criteria by which you're determining what are good granting projects as well. And so that's a way in which that integration of an element of lending with the rest of the granting ecosystem improves the performance, not just of the project, but also of the funding that's at play as well. So that's one thing that I would say about that I think is an answer to the first question that you raised. On the question of who gets the money, org sizes, fund sizes, loan sizes are often the really crucial thing here, where ideally we'd be able to put out $25,000 or $50,000 loans. You could do that, providing you have some capacity to cover the transaction costs, because approving a $50,000 loan carries just about as much work as approving a $500,000 loan, but you've got to do 10 times the work to get those $10, $50,000 loans out the door. But that's the loan size you need to get to if you're going to serve a lot of those smaller organizations. So that's one of the things why we're trying to get a lot of the market building capacity to be non-repayable grants so that it can cover some of the transaction costs that allow us to get the actual loan size small enough to engage with a lot of the smaller cultural nonprofits. Just on the record, my cultural nonprofit was tiny. It was a $400,000 organization. Now, over the course of when it built that project, it is now, sort of close to $1 million at this point as a result of that revenue diversification. But if we had set the terms in terms of, you have to have like a $500,000 org or bigger, we wouldn't have qualified. So I think we're a case that's in my mind as I'm trying to respond to that. The other question I think that's relevant here that gets raised a lot is the equity issue. How are you going to make sure that organizations that have come from historically marginalized populations are able to work with this kind of capital? We get that question a lot from our funding partners. And the first thing that I say to them is, we aren't, you are. Because if we're going to do a circumstance where they're asking us to solve historic inequities in a funding landscape using loans, then you're giving those people those marginalized communities a kind of double whammy, because A, they're not getting the grants. It's letting the funding organizations off the hook in terms of making their operating funding more equitable. And B, you're making them deal only with repayable capital. So they don't have the foundation of grant capital to help secure the repayable capital in that mix. And so we're really trying to push back on that to make sure that this is not a way out for funding organizations that are reluctant to face the political blowback of making their operating and core funding grants more equitable. But that's another sort of thing that comes up a lot in terms of trying to make this fund perform in a way that really drives a lot of the goods that we want to see happen in the sector.
All right, we are way deep into the speed round. We've got 2 minutes and 3 questions.
Okay. Sorry.
That's okay.
Shorter answers from now on.
2-word answers. Go ahead.
Okay, hi. I'll try to be quick. So thank you so much for the presentation and for all the thoughtful questions. I worked with art nonprofits in the Middle East, Europe, and currently I'm leading a nonprofit art gallery in Washington, D.C. So I feel like aside from the risk, accountability, relevance, and resilience you mentioned, it's very important to also think of the systemic mindset change, especially for the old nonprofits organizations we're talking about, and also organizational financial literacy, which already you mentioned. I worked for this nonprofit in Armenia, actually, and they decided they got a lot of funding for this startup social enterprise to make this app. But all this funding was non-repayable. It was called investment. It was not a grant. And I guess my question is, this funding model is quite common, at least in Europe. I guess my question is, how this model is different, and why should the loans be appealing for the nonprofits in this way if they can get some investment which is not repayable?
Mm-hmm. I mean, partly I think it's a language hygiene issue. I mean, we like to use the word investment a lot of the time when we don't mean financial return, but we're trying to signal that there are lots of kinds of return associated with this capital. And what we're saying is, yes, we don't want to dissuade people from that argument, but ultimately to say we need a word that's fundamentally around investment where there's financial return. And it's that element of risk associated with financial return that we think will have a bit of a catalytic effect on that mindset change that you're talking about.
Good. Thank you, David. There was a comment in the chat. There's actually another couple of questions. Karen Gall-Mills has a similar kind of question to Anush that you should check out. We'll pass it on to you at the end. But I wanted to channel Michael Feldman here, who is asking about any lessons you might take from the Upstart collab of Laura Callahan.
Yeah. So we're going to be presenting alongside Laura in Berlin in a couple of weeks, and actually with Fran Sanderson as well. And so the big difference there is that Laura does not think that it's a good idea to try and do this with organizations that are not investment ready. So to Anush's point about mindset change and the crucial aspect of, does this organization have an entrepreneurial mindset? in Canada, we know that we could put a banking solution in front of the cultural sector right now and provide loans to all the organizations that are investment ready. What we want to figure out is whether we can start to provide loans to organizations that are not investment ready and that need to go on the journey towards getting investment ready. We're looking for that transformative effect. And I know that Upstart Collab thinks that that's a bad idea, and I respect them for that. But we're just operating in a context where we're fundamentally trying to have a value proposition to a policy community that is burdened with a cultural sector that is over dependent on grants. And that's not the same phenomenon that you're dealing with in the US.
All right, Michael, bring us home.
Okay, I'll do this really fast. In Canada, one place where you've got a real mix of public sector money and private investment capital is film and television. Are there any lessons from that sector?
Yeah, we're trying to work really closely with that because there was an impact fund that was started up and run through CFC by Anna Serrano, who's now the chancellor of OCAD University. She's on our advisory committee and is starting to try and pull in the lessons. Ultimately, those were forgivable loans, and they ended up forgiving most of them. So it was almost a grant. It doesn't really tell us what the kind of performance of risk inside the sector looks like.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Let's everyone give our big thanks to David for this great talk. You might have set the record for the most extensive chat transcript we will have had. It really started picking up at the end there. Lots of good.
Wonderful. Well, thanks.
I wish we had time to get to all of it, everyone.
Yeah.
I guess that's just a sign you need to come back for our next workshop. We've posted the calendar links in the chat there. Next time we're meeting is 2 weeks from today. It'll be at a different time. It'll be at 9 a.m. Eastern, 3 o'clock in Europe, for most of Europe. And so tune in then for our next talk, where Esben Danielson and Andrea Balden will be here for the next presentation, 2 weeks time, 3 hours earlier. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Everybody, thanks, David.